Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 5th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. First topic is a clarification / correction and expansion on a topic we discussed last week, the New York City mayoral candidate contest, in which, unexpectedly to most, Zohran Mamdani won, and therefore he is likely to be the next mayor of New York City. And so I had talked briefly about his background. He was born in Uganda, but his mother doesn't have as much of a connection to Uganda as his father, and I had perhaps given the impression that both his parents had deep roots in Uganda. That's true for his father, not so much for his mother. And so it gives me an opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to also discuss an interesting little bit of history that I didn't know about. So, Indians in Uganda. The presence of Indians in Uganda dates back to the late 19th century, when the British Empire brought thousands of South Asians, mostly from Gujarat and Punjab, which are regions in India. So the British Empire brought these South Asians to East Africa, of which Uganda is a part, and they were brought as indentured laborers to build the Uganda Railway. And after their contracts ended, many Indians remained, establishing businesses and forming a prosperous merchant class. And over time, this Indian community, though it was a small minority, came to dominate significant parts of Uganda's economy, especially in trade, manufacturing, and retail. And by the 1960s, Indians were often seen as a middleman minority, economically powerful but socially isolated from both the African majority and the British colonial elite. Fast forward to the early 1970s, when Idi Amin becomes the leader of Uganda, and he, in 1972, ordered the expulsion of all Asians, which were roughly about 60,000 to 80,000 people, gave them 90 days to leave the country. And of these 60 to 80,000, about 27,000, so roughly a third, were Ugandan citizens. But Amin made no distinction between Indians who were not citizens and were Ugandan citizens. And his reasons, Amin's reasons were, some of them included that he accused Asians of economic sabotage and hoarding wealth at the expense of native Ugandans. He claimed he had received a divine dream from God instructing him to expel the Asians, and he played on rising nationalist and anti-colonial sentiments, portraying the expulsion as an act of economic liberation and African empowerment. And what this allowed Amin to do is to seize properties and redistribute assets to his military allies and supporters. And this is often blamed for economic collapse, which occurred in Uganda. And so one of those people expelled was Zohran Mamdani's father. He was 6 years old at the time. And so he was stripped of his property, fled to various countries, and ended up in the U.S., the U.K., and India. So once Idi Amin left office, or after he was deposed, in the 1980s, Uganda began to reverse some of Amin's policies. And so in 1982, law allowed expelled Asians to reclaim confiscated properties. And then later on in the 80s, the Ugandan government actively invited Asians to return. And many did return and reclaim their businesses and rebuilt their lives. And so some of the people who returned included Zohran's father, and he married Zohran's mother in the late 80s, and they began splitting their time between Uganda and Delhi in India. And so Zohran was born in 1991 in Kampala, Uganda, which is the capital. And so while all this history is interesting in and of itself, I think it does. The reason we're bringing it up today is because I think it helps shed light on the Zohran Mamdani phenomenon and helps us understand some of the statements and what some of his actions, which seem bizarre at first blush, but when you kind of take into account his background and the broader cultural zeitgeist, what he's doing makes more sense.
How are you thinking about that making sense?
Well, for one thing, Zohran is an outsider. He's coming into a area in which he has no ancestral roots. In the case of Uganda, he and his family and his ancestors came into a foreign country, foreign land, among foreign people, and sort of manipulated the levers of power and economic influence, and was expelled. And I don't know if ironic would be the right word, but he's sort of he's reversing the roles, because he portrays himself as an outsider, a downtrodden person who wants to come in and rectify inequities in society. But his parents, his father for one, was actually expelled from the country where he grew up, because he was seen by the native population as an exploiter, someone who came in and caused inequities.
That is a recognizable pattern that many listeners will immediately start thinking about a particular group. And though that group fits into this category that I'm going to revisit again from last week, it is not distinctly and uniquely that particular group in mind. That one is the most salient in the West, and particularly in America, but it is a phenomenon that is extant in a lot of places around the world, particularly in less developed countries. I think the fact that it's happening here in the United States adds an interesting wrinkle to the dynamic. Amy Chua, in the early 2000s, wrote a book entitled World on Fire, and one of the major takeaways from the book is her documentation of what she terms market-dominant minorities. Some of the examples that she categorizes in the book are the Chinese in Southeast Asia. The Chinese minority, despite making up a small percentage of the population, controls significant portions of the private economy. Specifically, she mentions Malaysia, and then Indians, to our example here, very germane to what we're talking about, Indians in East Africa. And she specifically identifies the countries of Kenya and Uganda, where this pattern played out. The Lebanese in West Africa, Europeans in Latin America, Jews in post-communist Russia, and also in the Middle East. And she doesn't talk about it explicitly, but we could add Jews in the Western world, particularly in the United States, and particularly in certain institutions, elite molding and creating institutions like academia, Harvard and the other Ivy League, banking, Hollywood. She also mentions Croatians in the former Yugoslavia. And so I think it's interesting to play around with the idea of Mamdani as a market-dominant minority existing in the West and utilizing the contemporary structure of the Western world to become dominant in the United States, in a place that is foreign to him, because in a lot of ways, as you were alluding to, and I was using market-dominant minorities to tie the ideas together, he is a cosmopolitan in a cosmopolitan city. And so in some ways, he is the ultimate success story of what the propositional nation is, what America's founding mythos is post-1965. The idea that anyone from the world can come as a refugee, which being kicked out of another country in some sense makes you a refugee. You come to the United States and be able to reach your fullest potential, because in the United States, blood and soil nationalism is a hindrance, and we have, as Americans, we have shed that baggage, and so it allows people to flourish here in ways that they couldn't flourish anywhere else. And I think, as we'll lay out the contours of what the general election in New York City will end up playing out as, I think that dynamic will be on display with Mamdani as the ultimate cosmopolitan and Eric Adams as the nativist reactionary, pushing back against that on behalf of the forgotten natives who are being left behind as the world is opened up to these striving cosmopolitans.
To expand that analogy, in more ways than just his skin color. He's like Eric Adams is like the Idi Amin in this situation. So we have Idi Amin as the president of Uganda. We have Eric Adams as the mayor of New York City. You have an Indian outsider coming in, and they're both the black men are trying to expel the Indian. And as a reminder, in the primary, New York City, the two top Democrats were Mamdani was number one, and then below him was Cuomo. And Mamdani won predominantly among whites and Asians, but Cuomo won among Jews and among blacks and Hispanics. And Mamdani is the perfect candidate for white, hipster, young people from Brooklyn, because he, especially in the age of Trump, when the level of hatred that liberals and Democrats are feeling towards Trump is reaching dangerously high levels. Mamdani is in a lot of ways the perfect repudiation of Trump. Almost in every way, he's the opposite. He's young, Trump is old. He's Indian, Trump is white and is Aryan in appearance. And Trump is the Aryan who is using the power of the federal government to raid and remove mostly brown people from the United States. Mamdani is a brown person who's coming in and criticizing Heritage America, or when we'll get into this, the questioning and denigrating the very foundations of traditional America. So just this week, it came out that in 2009, Zohran Mamdani applied to Columbia University, and in his application, he checked the boxes for both Asian and Black or African American on the race section. And he wrote in, quote, Ugandan in a separate field asking for more detail. He ultimately was not admitted, but somehow the admission was leaked or came to the attention of the media this past week.
Somehow, yes. It must be a real mystery how that came to the corporate media's attention 16 years after it happened, when he suddenly becomes relevant. And the subtext here that I guess we haven't made explicit, but I'll go ahead and do so now, is that there is already, specifically in New York City, in the Northeast in the United States, but in America generally, there already is a market-dominant minority, and that is a subset of Jews. But as they're finding out in the wake of October 7th and Israel's response to Palestine, that there is increasingly an energy of a budding new market-dominant minority force, or coalition of forces that do not see the world in the same way that the older guard of market-dominant minorities in America do. And so, in a lot of ways, Mamdani is a sort of upstart challenger to the established market-dominant minority in the United States, and specifically in New York City. And the old market-dominant minority has significant control of the corporate media that almost certainly leaked this information that reflected poorly on Mamdani.
So back to Mamdani picking black on his application to Columbia. This came to light, and Mayor Eric Adams, along with other political opponents, has called Mamdani's racial identification, quote, deeply offensive, and suggested it was an attempt to manipulate affirmative action. And Adams has demanded that Columbia release Mamdani's full application record. As a slight aside, this gets at an interesting conflation that's often made between ethnicity or race on the one hand and nationality on the other. So in America, it's pretty straight. It's pretty simple, because when you say somebody's American, that really doesn't mean it now, especially nowadays, really doesn't tell you anything about their racial or ethnic composition. They could be sub-Saharan African, they could be East Asian, they could be European, or anything in between. But still, other countries like China, when you say Chinese, it's really just as much of an ethnic description as a national one. Even though in China, while the vast majority of Chinese are Han Chinese, there are non-Han ethnicities within China, but still the term Chinese has a very strong biological connotation. And something like Ugandan, I would argue, does this as well. When people say Ugandan, I think they're mostly referring to a biological description of a sub-Saharan African people in a specific geographic territory. But Mamdani is tacitly saying that anyone could be Ugandan. If he's Indian and he's Ugandan and presumably just as Ugandan as the sub-Saharan Africans who have been there for centuries, in fact, he would have to say that to justify coming in and having any sort of influence or power or control over Uganda, obviously like his father and his ancestors did in Uganda. If you're an outsider and you're coming in and you don't belong somewhere, it's hard to justify being able to come in and call the shots. And as Ness mentioned, the propositional nation idea, the idea that America is a propositional nation and that it's not based on ethnicity or religion, it's based on a set of principles, and that anybody from any race, any background can come onto the territory of the United States and declare allegiance to these principles that are just as American as a European American who's been there, whose ancestors trace back to the Mayflower. That idea is obviously crucial to Mamdani because he is about as foreign as you can get, and yet he's coming into the quintessential American city and seeks to exert power and influence and control over that. Yesterday was the 4th of July, Independence Day, and for the occasion, Zohran Mamdani put out a statement. I'm going to read it. Quote, "America is beautiful, contradictory, unfinished. I am proud of our country, even as we constantly strive to make it better, to protect and deepen our democracy, to fulfill its promise for each and every person who calls it home." There's a lot to say about that statement. First is the compliment. Any positive things he says about America are clearly not the thrust of the statement. They're thrown in there more as an afterthought. The clear thrust of the quote is to talk about how America sucks, basically, and that it has some potential. Yeah, there were some good ideas in the past, but there were promises made, but they were broken. There were a few good ideas sprinkled in there, but it takes someone like me, an outsider, someone who's not white, someone who's not Christian. I'm going to come in and see that potential that you had that you were never able to act on, and I'm going to use that to make the country great, to fulfill the promise. So Mamdani became a U.S. citizen only in 2018, and so he's been here about 7 years, and he's already knows the country just as well, if not better, than Americans who have been here, who can trace their family back generations. And he's using the "our country," and so the implication is he has just as much, if not more, say over where America goes from here as blacks and whites who have been here for generations. And so the last part is perhaps the most telling. He says, quote, "to fulfill its promise for each and every person who calls it home," it being America. And so the idea, again, I think the obvious implication is that anybody around the world who has managed to step foot in the territory of the United States and calls it home, whatever that means. So that would obviously include an illegal alien who's been living in the country for years and considers it home. He has just as much, that person has just as much of a stake and as much of a say in the future of the country, has just a valid of a claim on any sort of welfare benefits, has the right to vote, get a driver's license, everything. And then back in October 2020, Zohran put out a tweet, quote, "Happy Independence Day to all my fellow Ugandans." So I don't know. He uses the OUR pronoun in both statements referring to Americans and Ugandans. So I guess he considers himself just as much a Ugandan as an American.
I think the trap we're falling into here, and maybe you're not, maybe it's more a rhetorical purpose than a didactic one. I think you're giving too much credit to the veracity or the implied veracity in an objective sense of what he's saying. I don't think the intention is to be consistent universally over time. When he said that in 2020, it was presumably to gain some sort of cultural credibility in the United States and you can see a lot of similarities in the way that he is positioning himself. And even with that 4th of July statement here in 2025, there are a lot of similarities with how Barack Obama positioned himself in 2008 as someone who is fresh and exotic and energetic and airy and not very specific in what he says. Anyone can read just about anything into that statement that he made because, as Jeff alluded to or mentioned, that it was an afterthought to say that America is beautiful. I don't know if that is giving him enough credit, because I think there is things that people will be able to latch onto in that statement. Just about anyone could latch onto a certain part of the statement and say that, hey, this is a guy who understands New Horizons in a way that the old ensconced political machine might not. But to get down to the real brass tacks of it, I think that in Uganda, it is offensive to say that you're Ugandan if you're not African, if you're not sub-Saharan African, because Uganda, like many other countries in the world, has an inherent tie between nationality and race and ethnicity. But while it is insulting to say that someone who lives in Uganda but isn't African is Ugandan, it is similarly offensive to say that someone is American based on their racial identification. Think of how most people would react to the statement that the richest man in the world is African, an African-American immigrant, in fact. And so I suspect that Mamdani has learned in the subsequent 5 or 7 years that claiming to be a Ugandan doesn't have a lot of cachet in America. Just being an immigrant who conceives of America as the ultimate destination for all immigrants in the world, that is how he's going to position himself. I don't suspect that he will make many more references to his Ugandan heritage, such as it is, because while that may have had benefits early on, it doesn't any longer. And I think that is getting at the theme that I was trying to get at initially in saying that we're fool ourselves if we put too much credence in the objective truth value of the things that he's saying. He is learning that to become a market-dominant minority in America, that the way to do that is effectively to trash America's cultural heritage. But that is not how one gets to the top in Uganda, and that is not, I guarantee, without having looked at it, that is not at all how his father made a successful run of his life in Uganda. And so these market-dominant minorities, these deracinated, rootless, cosmopolitan types who are able to move from one place to another, places that are entirely different in so many ways, and still get to the top of both of them, that comes from being able to suss out what the differences are and what the cultural orientation required is to get to the top. And that's going to be much, much different in Uganda than it is in the United States, particularly in New York City. And of course, at its founding, that was not at all how America was conceived of by its founders. America was conceived as a white European Protestant country. The first law on naturalization that predated the Constitution becoming fully ratified restricted citizenship to free white men of good character. In the Federalist Papers, John Jay famously wrote, quote, "Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence," unquote.
It's hard to think of a stronger and clearer repudiation of diversity as our strength than that.
But that vision of America was killed in the mid-19th century in the second American founding following the war between the states. And then that second founding was killed again in the mid-20th century with the civil rights revolution. And so Mamdani is right to realize that that conception of America is long dead and gone among much of those who, quote, call America home, unquote, today. And I think Mamdani has a good grasp of the contemporary political landscape. You will recall prior to the 2024 election, Trump coming in for continued criticism for his, and by extension his supporters' refusal to accept the putative legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election, and how that was evidence of how he was unfit and had no regard for the truth and only had eyes for his own interests and pushing his own interests forward, and that those who were opposed to him were doing so out of principle, and that they would respect democratic outcomes and would never challenge the validity of elections just because they didn't like them. And that is how they culturally styled themselves. At least they did so until the results of the 2024 election didn't go their way. And it wasn't like they just were upset about Trump winning in 2024 right after the election occurred. And this extends to the present. In fact, The Economist and YouGov ran a poll the last week of June, so 7 months after the election occurred, and they asked respondents, quote, would you say that Donald Trump legitimately won the 2024 election or not, unquote. And the percentage of Harris voters who said Trump did not legitimately win the election was 41%. So almost half of Democrats, after they spent the better part of 5 years making a stink about how Trump and Republicans wouldn't accept the outcome of the 2020 election, effectively refused to accept the outcome of the 2024 election, one that was objectively much less close and was objectively more open and transparent in the process and the results than the 2020 election was. And yet still almost half of Democrats, for understandable reasons that somebody like Mamdani is able to intuitively grasp, because that is increasingly the name of the game in the Democratic West, where appeals to principles are only useful insofar as they advance interests, and they can be jettisoned when they don't do so. And somebody like Mamdani being able to shift back and forth and change as the situation and as the location requires is the type of person who is going to be the most successful in the post-unified American political framework.
A quote from Frank Herbert in one of the Dune books comes to mind. Quote, when I am weaker than you, I ask you for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I am stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that is according to my principles. It would appear, though, in this case that Democrats are more principled in terms of democracy than Republicans, because I would guess that if you had polled Republicans at the same time in 2021, so July 2021, what they thought about whether Biden had legitimately won the election, I suspect that a strong majority of Republicans would say Biden had not legitimately won the election. Now, I do agree that there was a lot more shady shenanigans going on in the 2020 election than in the 2024 election. So maybe you could say that the Republicans were still as principled.
I think that somewhat misses the point, because Republicans, particularly post Donald Trump down the elevator in 2015, MAGA-style Republicans, were consistently critical of the entire political process. Trump said during the Republican primaries and all through the 2016 general election campaign that the process was rigged and that it wasn't fair and that there were problems that needed to be fixed. And it the whole swamp needed to be drained, and the election process was part of that. And so it wasn't really a Republican principle to hold up the democratic process as it was playing out in the second decade of the 21st century as something that demanded reverence. But that was the approach that Democrats took. And so with the Republicans, to not trust the process is what you would expect. That was them talking about their principles about how the thing was rigged and sticking to them. And that same thing cannot be said about Democrats in 2024, who had talked about how the process was fair and until it didn't go their way. In an increasingly secular post-religious world, this makes sense because though it is often something that gets scoffed at by atheists, the idea that you need religion for morality, it turns out actually you do need religion for consistent moral standards, because if there isn't some supernatural force keeping score, then it makes sense to do whatever benefits yourself and benefits your own interests at the expense of enemies' interests. And Mamdani's family is a perfect illustration of that, with his father, who was an academic in Uganda, and the orientation he had towards the Ugandan political and cultural structure of the time versus how Mamdani, the son Mamdani, has an orientation towards the political and cultural dynamic in America. And those two orientations are quite different, but the end result is that both rise towards the top and get towards elite status.
We at the Reality Taboo will continue to cover the mayoral race in New York City.
Before we go, I'll briefly mention what the betting markets say about the election in November. A week ago, it was Mamdani at 75% and Eric Adams at 15%. That has significantly narrowed over the last week, where Mamdani now is just under 70% at 69.6%, and Eric Adams is at almost 25%. So it is a closing of about 15 percentage points in the betting markets. Still, Mamdani is, as we record this, an almost 3-1 favorite, but that is by no means a guaranteed conclusion, or something you could say that it's smart money for sure to bet on Mamdani. And I assume that part of that closing has to do with Cuomo, or I had assumed that it had to do with Cuomo saying he wasn't going to run as an independent, but now that I look at the news, he is still claiming that his name will be on the ballot and he is going to run as an independent. So I don't know what it was exactly that caused that closing in what the betting markets think the outcome will be. But in any case, as we follow it, we will give regular updates on that, because I think that is something, an interesting indicator alongside the polling results, of which I am a little bit PTSD'd about at the moment with how poorly the polling results performed in the primary. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.